My father passed away 3 years ago, and I never deleted his number from my phone. Yesterday, my thumb slipped while I was scrolling, and before I could stop it, I was calling a phone that had been disconnected for 3 years. It rang. A woman's voice answered, and she said the words that broke my entire understanding of my father in half. She said, "Is this Dad's phone? I've been waiting so long for someone to finally call me back." My name is Alicia Monroe, and I had no idea, until that phone call, that my father had spent the last 12 years of his life keeping a daughter he never told me existed. Before we move forward, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming amazing videos. My name is Alicia Monroe, and before I tell you about the phone call that unraveled everything I thought I understood about my father, I need you to understand who he was to me, because the man I'm about to describe losing a second time, in a completely different way, was someone I believed I knew as completely as any daughter can know her father. My father, Reginald Monroe, was, for the 26 years I had him in my life, the steadiest presence I have ever known. He worked as a high school history teacher in a small city in North Carolina, the kind of teacher former students still stopped him in grocery stores to thank, decades after having him in class. He married my mother, Vivian, when they were both in their late 20s, and by every account I ever heard from anyone who knew them during those years, their marriage was a genuinely happy one, built on the kind of easy partnership that made their friends half jealous and half inspired. I was born 3 years into that marriage, their only child, and I grew up in a household that, looking back with the clarity adulthood eventually provides, was remarkably stable compared to so many of my friends' families. My father was the parent who showed up to everything. Every school play, even the ones where I had a single line and stood in the back row of a crowded stage. Every basketball game during my brief, unremarkable middle school athletic career. Every parent-teacher conference. Every awards ceremony. Every ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I needed help with algebra homework he probably found more interesting than I did. He had a specific laugh, loud and unself-conscious, that I could pick out of a crowded room even as a small child, and I spent my entire childhood and young adulthood believing that laugh, that presence, that steady devotion, represented the entirety of who my father actually was. My parents' marriage ended when I was 14, not through any dramatic betrayal that I was aware of at the time, but through the slow, ordinary erosion that sometimes happens even to genuinely good marriages, two people growing in different directions over enough years that the partnership eventually stops working the way it once did. The divorce was, as these things go, relatively amicable. My father moved into an apartment across town, and I split my time between both households without the kind of bitter custody battles or ongoing hostility that defined so many of my friends' experiences with divorced parents. I want to emphasize this because it matters to what comes later. My parents' divorce was not marked by any specific revelation of betrayal or secret-keeping that I was aware of. It simply looked, from every angle I had access to, like two good people who had grown apart. What I did not know, what I would not learn until 3 years after my father's death, was that 18 months before that divorce was finalized, while my parents' marriage was already quietly unraveling behind closed doors, my father had begun a relationship with a woman named Carla Jennings, a relationship that produced a daughter, my half-sister, born just 8 months after my parents officially separated. I did not know this daughter existed. I did not know my father had a second family running in parallel to significant portions of my own childhood and adolescence. I did not know, until a single accidental phone call 3 years after his death, that for the final 12 years of his life, my father had been quietly present in the life of a daughter he never once mentioned to me, never once introduced me to, never once found the courage or the opportunity to explain. My father passed away 3 years ago from a sudden cardiac event, at his desk, grading papers on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, the kind of death that felt both devastatingly abrupt and, in its own strange way, fitting for a man who had spent his entire career fully present in the work he loved. I was 26 years old when I lost him, old enough to have built an independent adult life, young enough that his absence still felt like losing the ground beneath my feet entirely. The grief of those first months is not something I can fully articulate even now. The specific disorientation of moving through a world that no longer contained the person who had shaped so much of how I understood safety and steadiness. In the years since his death, I had built a careful, private ritual around his memory that I've since come to understand many people who lose a parent unexpectedly develop in their own ways. I never deleted his phone number from my contacts, despite knowing the line had been disconnected months after his death, when my mother finally handled the practical business of closing out his accounts. I kept it there, labeled simply Dad, a small, static piece of digital permanence in a life that had otherwise been forced to continually adjust to his absence. I would sometimes scroll past his name in my contacts, occasionally even open his old text thread to reread conversations from years earlier, a small private comfort that I never fully explained to anyone, not even my closest friends, understanding it as a slightly unusual but harmless way of maintaining some tether to a man I wasn't ready to fully release. 3 years after his death, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, scrolling through my phone while distracted by something on television, my thumb slipped against the screen while I was navigating past his contact entry, and before I fully registered what was happening, the call had already connected, already begun ringing through my phone's speaker into the quiet of my apartment. I remember the specific, disorienting panic of that moment, understanding immediately that I had accidentally dialed a number that had been disconnected for years, expecting the flat, automated message informing me the number was no longer in service, already reaching to end the call before that message could even begin playing. It rang instead. Once, twice, 3 times, the ordinary rhythm of an active phone line, and I remember sitting frozen on my couch, my heart suddenly pounding in a way that made no rational sense given what I logically understood to be true, that this was simply a recycled number, reassigned to some stranger with no connection to my father at all, that whoever answered would have absolutely no idea who I was, or why I was calling a number they'd likely had for months or years without incident. And then, on the 4th ring, someone picked up, a woman's voice, warm and slightly hesitant, the voice of someone answering a call from an unfamiliar number with the particular caution most people reserve for numbers they don't recognize. I don't remember exactly what I said in those first confused seconds, some garbled apology for what I assumed was a wrong number, already preparing to hang up and process the strange, disorienting emotional experience of having accidentally called a disconnected line that some stranger now apparently possessed. But before I could finish my apology, before I could end the call and return to the ordinary evening I'd been having moments earlier, the woman on the other end of the line asked me a question that stopped everything in my chest at once. She asked, her voice carrying a specific, careful hope that I would spend the following weeks trying to fully understand, whether this was Reginald Monroe's phone, whether I was perhaps calling on his behalf, because she said, quietly, that she had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally call her back. I sat frozen on my couch, my phone pressed so hard against my ear it was almost painful, trying to process what I was hearing. I asked her, my voice barely functioning, how she knew my father's name, and there was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause that stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, more careful, more uncertain, as though she was suddenly recalculating who she might actually be talking to. She asked me, gently, who I was to Reginald. I told her, my voice shaking, that I was his daughter. There was another long silence, and then she said something that rearranged my entire understanding of my father in a single sentence. She said, quietly, that she was his daughter too. I don't have adequate words for what I felt in that moment, sitting in my apartment, 3 years removed from burying a man I believed I had known completely, listening to a stranger's voice calmly inform me that we shared a father I had spent 26 years believing belonged entirely to me. I asked her name. She told me it was Destiny Jennings, that she was 23 years old, that her mother, a woman named Carla, had been in a relationship with my father that began, she believed, sometime before my parents' divorce was finalized, though she was careful, even in that first disorienting conversation, to say she didn't know all the details of the timeline herself. We talked for almost 2 hours that first night, both of us too stunned by the sudden collision of our separate understandings of the same man to end the call. Both of us, I think, desperate to piece together a fuller picture of a father we had each believed, in our own separate ways, belonged fully to us. Destiny told me that her mother had met my father through a mutual friend, that their relationship had developed slowly over what she believed was roughly 18 months before her own birth, and that throughout her entire childhood, my father had been present in her life in a specific, carefully managed way, visits several times a month, financial support, phone calls on a schedule that apparently never once overlapped, in all the years she could remember, with whatever life he was building on the other side of town with me. I asked her, needing to understand the exact shape of what I was hearing, whether she had known about me, whether her mother had known about my mother, whether this had been some kind of open arrangement that both households had simply agreed to keep separate, or whether it was something else entirely, something closer to the specific betrayal it was starting to feel like on my end of the phone. Destiny told me that she had known about me for as long as she could remember, that my father had told her, from a young age, that he had another daughter from an earlier part of his life, a half-sister she had always known existed but had never met, had never even seen a photograph of, and had eventually stopped asking about after years of gentle, evasive non-answers whenever she pushed for more information about why they'd never been introduced. This detail, more than almost anything else in that first conversation, was the one that broke something open in me. My father had told his second daughter about my existence, however incompletely, however carefully managed the information had been. He had never told me anything at all about her. For 26 years, I had lived believing I was his only child, his only daughter, the sole recipient of a devotion I now understood had been quietly, deliberately divided between two households for at least 12 of those years, maybe longer, depending on exactly when Destiny's relationship with him had actually begun, relative to the end of my parents' marriage. Destiny told me that her mother had asked my father repeatedly, over the years, when he intended to tell me about Destiny's existence, when the two of us might finally be allowed to meet, and that my father had always offered some version of the same answer, that he needed the right moment, that my mother and I were still adjusting to the divorce, that introducing this additional complexity would cause more harm than waiting for a more stable time. Destiny told me, with what sounded like a complicated mixture of understanding and long-buried hurt, that this promised right moment had never actually arrived, not in 12 years, not before his sudden death removed any possibility of it ever arriving at all. I asked her the question that had been building in me since she first said the word sister. I asked her if she believed my father had loved her, genuinely, or whether she had spent her entire childhood as some kind of secondary consideration, a secret carefully managed, rather than a daughter fully claimed. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a specific, weathered honesty that told me this wasn't the first time she had wrestled with this exact question herself. She told me that she believed, based on the consistency of his presence in her life, the genuine warmth she remembered from their visits, the effort he clearly made to show up for her despite the complicated secrecy surrounding the entire arrangement, that he had loved her as fully as he was capable of loving anyone under the specific, self-imposed constraints he had built around his own double life. But she also told me, with a rawness that mirrored my own growing anger, that loving someone while permanently hiding them from the rest of your family is its own specific, complicated kind of harm, one she had spent years trying to understand and had never fully resolved even before this call. We ended that first conversation without any clear plan for what came next, both of us too overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what we'd just learned to make any immediate decisions about what our relationship, if any, might look like going forward. But before we hung up, Destiny asked me if I would be willing to talk again, and I told her yes, understanding even in my shock and anger that whatever my father had done, whatever secrets he had kept from both of us in different configurations, Destiny herself was not responsible for any of it, was, in fact, someone who had navigated her own complicated version of loving and losing the same man I had spent 3 years grieving, as though I alone held the full truth of who he had been. I hung up that phone that night and sat alone in my apartment for a long time, staring at the number still saved simply as Dad in my contacts, trying to reconcile the man I had buried 3 years earlier with the man Destiny had just described. A man capable of extraordinary consistency and devotion, and simultaneously capable of maintaining, for over a decade, a secret significant enough to reshape both of his daughters' entire understanding of their own childhoods the moment it finally came to light. The days following that first phone call with Destiny were some of the most disorienting of my adult life, a strange, vertiginous period where I found myself questioning memories I had never once doubted before, wondering which family trips, which ordinary weekends, which stretches of my father's supposedly full attention had actually been shared, unknowingly, with a version of his life running in complete parallel to my own. I called my mother 2 days after that first conversation with Destiny, needing to understand whether she had known anything about this, whether the amicable, uncomplicated divorce I had always understood my parents to have shared had actually been built on a foundation far more fractured than I'd ever realized. My mother's reaction to my questions confirmed something I had begun to suspect, but hadn't yet allowed myself to fully believe. She told me, her voice tight with an old, carefully managed pain I had never once detected in all the years since the divorce, that she had, in fact, discovered evidence of my father's relationship with Carla during the final year of their marriage. Evidence significant enough that it had been the actual primary catalyst for their separation, though she had made a deliberate decision, at the time, to shield me from the full details, believing a 14-year-old didn't need to understand the specific circumstances of her parents' divorce beyond the basic fact that it was happening. She told me she had confronted my father directly when she discovered the affair, and that he had ended the relationship with Carla at that time, or at least claimed to, promising my mother it was over, a promise my mother had chosen to believe, or at least chosen not to further investigate, focused as she was on managing the practical and emotional wreckage of ending a 14-year marriage while protecting me from as much of the fallout as possible. What my mother had not known, what apparently no one in my immediate family had known until Destiny's own existence surfaced through that accidental phone call, was that my father had never actually ended his relationship with Carla, or if he had, for some brief period following my mother's confrontation, he had resumed it, or perhaps continued it in some more careful, hidden capacity, closely enough afterward that Destiny had been born within the year and had remained a consistent, quietly maintained presence in his life for the following 12 years, running in complete parallel to the entirety of my adolescence and young adulthood without either my mother or me ever detecting a single sign of it. I want to describe the specific quality of anger I felt during this period because it was different from any anger I had experienced before, a kind of retroactive fury that reshaped my understanding of an entire childhood I had believed, until that phone call, to be essentially happy and stable. Every memory I revisited during those weeks now carried a second, hidden layer I hadn't previously known to look for. The father who showed up to every school event, every basketball game, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon of homework help, had also, during those same years, been quietly present for another daughter's milestones, her own school events, her own ordinary Tuesday afternoons, managing 2 entirely separate paternal identities with a level of careful compartmentalization that felt, the longer I sat with it, almost impossible to fully comprehend. I reached out to Destiny again about a week after our first conversation, and this time we decided to meet in person, a decision that felt necessary despite the enormous emotional risk it carried, both of us understanding that continuing to process this revelation entirely over the phone would only prolong the strange, unresolved limbo we'd both been living in since that accidental call. We met at a coffee shop roughly halfway between our respective cities, and I remember the specific, disorienting experience of watching her walk toward my table, seeing pieces of my father's face reflected in features I had never expected to encounter in another living person. The shape of his eyes, a particular way of tilting her head that I recognized instantly and painfully from decades of watching him do the exact same thing. We talked for hours that day, working through years of separately held memories, comparing notes on a father who had apparently performed 2 distinct, carefully managed versions of himself for each of us, and slowly, painfully, building a fuller, more complicated picture of who he had actually been. Destiny told me stories from her childhood that mirrored my own in ways that were almost unbearable to hear. Our father teaching each of us the same specific way to ride a bike, using nearly identical phrases of encouragement, celebrating our respective childhood achievements with what sounded like the exact same enthusiastic pride, all of it happening in parallel, in separate households, without either of us ever knowing the other existed. The heaviest disagreement between Destiny and me during this period, one that took months to work through even after that initial meeting, centered on how differently we each processed our anger toward our father's memory. I found myself, in the weeks following our reconnection, wanting to fully condemn him, to reduce his memory entirely to the scale of his deception, unable to reconcile the steady, present father I remembered with a man capable of maintaining a secret this significant for over a decade. Destiny, while sharing much of my anger, resisted this full condemnation in a way that initially frustrated me, insisting that our father's love for both of us, however flawed and however constrained by his own cowardice and secrecy, had still been genuine, that the specific harm of his choices didn't necessarily erase the specific reality of the devotion he'd shown each of us individually, even if that devotion had been built on a foundation neither of us had consented to or even known about. We argued about this, more than once, during those difficult months of coming to understand each other and our shared, complicated inheritance. I told her that his love, however genuinely felt in isolated moments, could not be separated from the fundamental deceit that had defined how he expressed it. That a love requiring this level of ongoing secrecy and compartmentalization was, in some essential way, compromised by the very structure that had allowed it to exist at all. Destiny argued that reducing him entirely to his deception erased the real felt experience of a childhood that had, in its own specific and limited way, included genuine paternal love and consistent presence, however incomplete that presence had ultimately been. We didn't fully resolve this disagreement, not in any clean or satisfying way, and I've come to understand, in the years since, that we probably never will fully resolve it, that Destiny and I are likely permanently positioned to hold slightly different, equally valid understandings of who our father actually was, shaped by the specific circumstances of how each of us came to learn the truth about the other, and by the different ways our individual childhoods were affected by a secret neither of us asked to be part of. The months following that first in-person meeting with Destiny became a slow, careful process of building something neither of us had a roadmap for, a sibling relationship that began not through shared childhood experience, but through the shared, disorienting work of reconstructing a father neither of us had fully known. We started talking regularly, not every day at first, but consistently enough that the strangeness of her existence in my life gradually softened into something closer to familiarity, even as the underlying grief and anger about how we'd come to know each other never fully disappeared. I want to talk about a specific turning point in our relationship, because it represents, more than almost anything else, how Destiny and I eventually moved from cautious, wary reconnection into something that actually resembled sisterhood. About 4 months after our first meeting, Destiny invited me to her mother's house, an invitation that carried enormous weight given everything I understood about Carla's role in the collapse of my own parents' marriage. I remember sitting in my car outside that house for almost 15 minutes before I found the courage to go inside, wrestling with a complicated tangle of emotions I hadn't fully anticipated. Curiosity about the woman who had loved my father, residual anger about the pain her relationship with him had caused my own family, and an underlying, more complicated recognition that Carla, like Destiny, had also been navigating her own version of a relationship built on my father's careful compartmentalization and incomplete honesty. Carla was, when I finally went inside, nothing like the version of her I had unconsciously constructed in my angriest moments over the preceding months. She was warm, careful, visibly nervous about meeting me, and within the first 20 minutes of our conversation, she told me something that reshaped my understanding of the entire situation once again. She told me that she herself had not known, for the first several years of her relationship with my father, that he was still legally married, that he had presented himself to her initially as already separated, and that by the time she discovered the actual truth of his still ongoing marriage to my mother, she was already pregnant with Destiny and found herself facing an impossible choice between raising her daughter without her father entirely present or accepting the complicated, partial presence he was offering instead. This detail added yet another layer of complexity to a story that already felt, by that point, almost impossibly tangled. My father had not simply been managing two relationships with full transparency to both women involved. He had, at least initially, deceived Carla as thoroughly as he had eventually deceived my mother, building his entire double life on a foundation of lies that implicated every single person involved except the two children, Destiny and me, who had simply been born into circumstances neither of us had any control over or awareness of. Understanding Carla's own experience of betrayal helped me, slowly, begin to separate my anger toward my father from any anger I might have otherwise directed toward Destiny or Carla themselves, both of whom, I came to understand more fully with each conversation, had been navigating their own version of the same fundamental deception that had shaped my own childhood, just from a different angle, with different specific details, but rooted in the same core failure of honesty that defined my father's approach to the two families he had built and maintained in careful, permanent separation from each other. Destiny and I spent the following year building what has become, genuinely, one of the most important relationships of my adult life. A sisterhood forged not through shared childhood memories, but through the difficult, ongoing work of understanding a father we each only partially knew, and choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to build something real between us despite the complicated and painful circumstances of how we came to know each other existed. We spent hours comparing old photographs, discovering that our father had, in fact, kept pictures of each of us hidden in separate, careful places in his respective lives, evidence that he had genuinely tried, in his own limited and ultimately insufficient way, to hold space for both of his daughters, even while never finding the courage to bring us together while he was alive. I want to be honest about where things stand now, several years removed from that accidental phone call that started this entire unraveling. My relationship with Destiny has become genuinely important to me, a sisterhood I did not expect and would not trade now that I have it, despite everything painful about how we came to find each other. My understanding of my father, however, remains permanently complicated in a way I don't think will ever fully resolve into either simple forgiveness or complete condemnation. I have made a kind of peace with holding both truths simultaneously, that he was, in the ways I directly experienced growing up, a genuinely devoted and present father, and that he was also, simultaneously, a man capable of a specific, sustained deception, significant enough to permanently reshape two entire families without either of them ever having the chance to consent to the terms of that deception, or even, until his sudden death forced its eventual discovery, the basic knowledge that it existed at all. I still have his number saved in my phone, though I've since learned, through a conversation with Destiny, that the number was actually reassigned to her roughly a year after his death, that she had been living with that number, hoping, in some quiet and probably irrational corner of her mind, that someone from his side of the family might eventually call it, might finally reach out and close the strange, unresolved loop of a relationship she had spent her entire childhood only partially understanding. I think about the specific improbability of that accidental call often, my thumb slipping at exactly the right moment to connect a call that had been technically impossible for years, reaching exactly the person who had apparently been waiting, in her own way, for exactly that kind of connection to finally happen. I used to believe the worst moment of my life was standing at my father's graveside 3 years ago, watching him lowered into the ground, believing in that moment that I understood the full shape of everything I had lost. I understand now that grief is rarely as complete or as final as it feels in that first devastating moment, that sometimes the people we lose continue revealing themselves to us long after they're gone, in ways that complicate rather than simplify our understanding of who they actually were. What I've learned, In the years since that accidental phone call rearranged my entire understanding of my father's life, is that love and deception are not always opposites, that a person can be both genuinely devoted and profoundly dishonest simultaneously, and that the work of reconciling those two truths, however uncomfortable and ongoing it remains, is sometimes the only way forward toward understanding, imperfectly but honestly, who the people we loved actually were, underneath everything they chose not to tell us while they still had the chance.